All right. Sorry, Tom, you're going to have to reshare there as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure. Yep, sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the second in a four-part series of leadership webinars offered by the Office of Public Engagement. This series would not have been possible without our partnership with the Gardner Center and the support of the Conference and Event Services team at Memorial's Emera Innovation Exchange. Before we get things underway, I just wanted to take a brief moment to thank all of you for taking the time to connect with us online today. Life has certainly gotten a bit more challenging and we're all being affected differently. But here we are today, a family of alumni and friends sharing in the desire to connect, learn, and grow with the challenges we're all facing. So for all the ups and downs that you may be facing, I just wanted to say thank you for all of your efforts to get through this and for joining us today. We're very lucky to have Dr. Tom Cooper with us to discuss adapting organizational strategy in uncertain times. Dr. Cooper is an associate professor of strategic management at the Faculty of Business Administration. At Memorial, he lectures in the areas of strategy, risk management, and ethics and values at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. His research is primarily focused on the interplay between strategy and risk management, and his research has been published widely in industry and academic publications. And he's won a number of awards for his research, teaching, and engagement activities. Prior to taking his position at Memorial University, Dr. Cooper was a senior manager in PwC's Performance Improvement Consulting practice in London, UK. He's an active facilitator with the Gardner Center here at Memorial, a business advisor, board member, and is a certified management consultant. Dr. Cooper is also a regular speaker to industry conferences on his research. He holds a Doctor of Philosophy in Business from the Warwick Business School, the University of Warwick, as well as a Bachelor of Commerce Co-op and Bachelor of Arts Philosophy from Memorial University. We're very lucky. So today we'll be continuing this new online WebEx platform. It's got a lot of wonderful features, so I'll ask your patience. If any glitches do occur, we're in great hands. John Duff is in the background, taking care of us all, and I think it's going to go very well. The event is being recorded, and it will be available online in the days following the event. Dr. Cooper will present for 20 minutes, give or take, followed by a Q&A period of about 20 minutes. To ensure that I get your questions, and this is kind of important for everyone to remember, I'll introduce this again later. In order for me to get your questions, I ask that you only use the Q&A function on the right of this window that we're in. It might need to be expanded, so if you look to the right and see Q&A, there's a little arrow before Q&A. If you click that, it'll expand the Q&A little window, and that's where you can put in your questions. You can share them publicly or send them to me privately, but please avoid using the chat function of this as well as sending questions to either John or Dr. Cooper in the background. Please send them to me. You're welcome to type your questions into the Q&A at any time during the presentation, and I'll read them once Dr. Cooper is finished. Dr. Cooper, thank you for being here today. I will hand it over to you.
Great experiments with online delivery and online presentations. As a proud alumnus of Memorial University, it's a great pleasure to be speaking to you all today in the comfort of my home. And I was joking to John and Justin beforehand, the first casualty of the quarantine came yesterday afternoon when I was trimming my beard to get ready for this talk and slipped, and now I look 12 again. So I looked like I was in university again as an undergraduate. So lesson learned, don't trim your own beard. So today we're going to be talking about adapting organizational strategy in uncertain times. This is a really interesting subject, both in terms of trying to predict what the future is going to be, and then secondly, thinking about how do we start to strategize it and how do we start to prepare for it and develop the tactics and models to make sure that we take advantage of opportunities and we mitigate the risks, the downside risks that we may be facing. As a good Newfoundlander, I have a tendency to speak fast. I apologize for that. I will try and go slow. Hopefully Justin will send me a note if I'm going really, really fast, but I'm excited about this. And I'm excited about this subject, and I'm excited that we have so many people who are interested in it as well. So in terms of what we're going to talk about in the next 20 minutes, we're going to do a really high-level overview talking about a little bit about the times we live in. We live in a number of ways. The word bubble has become de rigueur, and we kind of live in a bubble here in Newfoundland and Labrador. So we'll give some context in terms of what's happening, not only within the province, but elsewhere as well. We're going to talk a little bit about predicting the future. Now, predicting the future is a mug's game in a number of ways, because if anybody could predict the future, you wouldn't be here. You'd be in Las Vegas when it opens up, gambling and making lots and lots of money. But we'll talk about what is plausible and what's probable and what are some of the different scenarios that are out there. Next is kind of the crux of the talk, where we're talking about what are some of the strategies that you and your organizations you work for can adapt and can use to come out of this pandemic successful. And that'll be the last point in terms of how do you find success, and what do we mean by success coming out of this pandemic, coming out of this environment, and moreover, coming out of these uncertain times. So the times we live in. The Economist Intelligence Unit recently talked about some of the bigger trends that are going on, which we may not be aware of here in Newfoundland and Labrador. For example, the weakening financial health of U.S. states is a big, big concern. States, not only the ones that we see, such as New York and California, but smaller states in terms of their ability to finance infrastructure, resources, et cetera, been very much compromised by the pandemic. In Europe, the Eurozone growth fell 6% in the first quarter of 2020. Now, you may be saying 6%, hey, that's a small number, but the ramifications of that are very, very significant. We normally don't see falling growth. If anything, we see static or maybe a percentage or two, but growth falling 6% is very significant. In Canada and the US, we've seen consumer demand crashing, not only in the hospitality sector and in food and beverages, et cetera, but across a whole number of different areas. We've seen bankruptcies in the retail sector. We've seen the travels, two major airlines last week declared bankruptcy in the United States. One of the biggest one in South America, which is partially owned by Delta, declared bankruptcy. So there is consumer crash, especially in specific sectors, such as travel, tourism, food, beverages to a lesser extent, apparel, etc. But what's also interesting is we talk about China, but Chinese businesses, which are very, which is kind of the manufacturing sector of the world, where 25 to 40% of everything that's made in specific sectors comes specifically from China, they also face a collapse in exports because of the crash in demand and because of the weakening financial health. So the times we live in are very uncertain. Moreover, if we take the focus to Canada, in Newfoundland and Labrador, as we know, tourism and travel have been severely interrupted. I don't live that far away from the airport, and yesterday or the day before, I was out raking the lawn, and I said, "Oh, look at the plane." It's kind of like a new thing. But we've gone to where there's maybe 2-3 flights a day versus 20 or 30 or even more that we're used to. Moreover, the province is encouraging us, as we see, to say, look, you're not going anywhere for the summer. You might as well have a staycation. So the great investments that have been made in travel and tourism by the province and by entrepreneurs here in Newfoundland and Labrador over the last 20 years have been severely interrupted. Moreover, the other big sector, which has huge implications, especially to rural Newfoundland and Labrador, in terms of oil and gas industries, those challenges, because of not only the pandemic, but because of the demand that's been severely lessened, are both short, medium, and long term as well. Those travel and tourism and oil and gas and other industries, the cash flow that they generate in terms of royalties and taxation, et cetera, also has ramifications then in terms of socio and economic challenges, which we're not seeing at this point. Well, we may be seeing it to a little bit of an extent, but more so as we go into this uncertain times in terms of education. So if there's a second wave, do we pull the children out of schools? How long does that take? At Memorial, most of our classes are going to be online. As someone who's teaching remotely for the first time ever, it's a challenge. How we deal with healthcare, all those elective surgeries that have been postponed, how are we going to deal with that? Moreover, we, as municipalities in Newfoundland and Labrador, has been saying over the last number of years, we face a significant infrastructure deficit at a municipal level here in the province. That is a big concern, especially for smaller municipalities that face declining tax base outside of the St. John's area. How are we going to fund the infrastructure to keep our roads, to keep our water and sewer, all those sort of things as well. And moreover, an area that's of real interest to me is in terms of food access, not so much in terms of the food supply chains, which I think are very robust, but in terms of if people don't have the money to get good quality food and they're going to be relying on food banks, et cetera, how are we going to deal with this? Moreover, even further in the future, the impact of a potential future of a global debt crisis also weighs down. Ultimately, we live in a time of very, very cheap debt, and that is one saving grace where I was speaking to my parents about debt back in the 1980s when there was kind of one of the first big oil crashes, and they said basically it was 18 or 19% to get a car loan back then. Now, people or governments can give negative interest rates, which is a whole interesting area. But ultimately, this money has to be paid back. And this money is going to have to be paid back by future generations. So, and moreover, in places that are not a robust economy, Argentina is about to default on their debt. Other countries are talking about defaulting on their debt, and that has ripple effects throughout the whole global economy. So the Economist Intelligence Unit also came up with a number of different scenarios in terms of the controversies driving the global economy into an economic depression, an escalating U.S.-China trade war. But on the other side, the global economy could bounce back quite quickly as the coronavirus proves to be less damaging than expected, which is similar to what we saw in 2008, 2009 with the global financial crash, where markets fell for example, retail spending fell 3% in 1 year and then bounced back 6% the next year. So ultimately, we have I would summarize it as we live in uncertain times. And what's interesting is you're probably seeing in the press this notion of black swan. So saying, oh, the pandemic was something that was a black swan event. And a black swan event is a term that was popularized by Nicholas Nassim Taleb. And Taleb talks about black swan being an unpredictable event that is beyond what is normally expected of a situation and has potentially severe consequences. So you can't predict a pandemic. You can't think of a pandemic. It was one of those things that just hit us. It happened on my birthday. It happened on March 18th. Other people argue, well, no, this is more like a gray rhino. And a gray rhino is something that's there. That's something that we know about, that's obvious, it's visible, has large impact, but we kind of ignore it. And even Taleb himself, he said, no, the pandemic and the World Economic Forum was talking about pandemics. It was talking about the role of infectious diseases. Moreover, here, as we know from the history of Newfoundland and Labrador, if you're from Labrador, 100 years ago, plus one, with the Spanish influenza, the impact in Inuit communities on the North Coast in terms of Hebron and Oka were incredibly significant. So this may be a 1 in 100 year, 1 in 150 year event, but what it does do, it kind of points moreover to the uncertainty that we live in. So how do we start to think about this uncertainty? How do we start to deal with this uncertainty? How do we start to manage the uncertainty? Donald Rumsfeld, and you're saying, oh my God, he's gone from Taleb to Donald Rumsfeld. How is Donald Rumsfeld, if you don't remember who he was the U.S. Secretary of State. And during the first Gulf War, he came up and made a press announcement. And the press announcement was talking about what was going on in Iraq. And in Iraq, he was saying, basically, we have a whole bunch of things called unknown unknowns. And this is a good way of thinking about predictability. And now, because of his, it wasn't an intentional remark, but we come up with what we call the Rumsfeld matrix. And when we look at risk in organizations or in life, and we look at observability, we have what we call known knowns. We know something is a fact. You know your mother loves you. You know your father loves you. Those are known knowns. Then we also have some known unknowns. Okay, well, I don't know what I'm going to have for dinner next week, but at some point I'm going to have to eat. The risk is that I don't have enough money to go eat, or I don't I can't cook, or, I can't get food, but those knowns are out there. At some point, I'm going to have to eat. At some point, I'm going to have to pay taxes. The unknown knowns are lower risk, but, we can live with them. They're events. And then the unknown unknowns is where I think we are right now, which is they're high risk, and there's not huge amounts of observability. We don't know where the actual future could be. So that means is that if we translate that into terms of our knowledge, we do have knowledge about where we are right now. We know that in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have some demographic challenges. We have fiscal challenges. We also know that we have we live in a beautiful place, and we have a very resilient people. What we know in terms of the assumptions are, we have a federal government that's been very generous and is working well with us. We have that people are going to be resilient, all those sort of things as well. But there's gaps. There's things that we don't know. And those gaps are what ultimately we start to have to think about in terms of strategy. How can we start to address that gap in our knowledge, that gap in terms of this uncertainty, so that we can make it more about knowledge and then reasonable, plausible assumptions, rather than gaps or places where we're going to have to make discoveries about something new, something we've never been into before. So we would summarize this as we live in what we call a VUCA world, which is it's volatile. Things are changing all the time. We live in uncertainty, as I've mentioned before. There's not the way things were done 2 years ago is probably not the way things are going to be done in 2 years from now. But it's also very complex because, as mentioned before, all those things that are happening globally, all those things that are happening locally, all those things that are happening nationally leads to complexity. And moreover, it is ambiguous. If you look at it in terms of where you should take your company, where should you take your career, where should you take yourself in terms of going forward strategy, there's going to be some ambiguity from there. So that VUCA, which is an acronym for volatile, uncertain, complexity, and ambiguity, is a good way of thinking about when you're starting to develop a strategy. How do I develop all those? How do I start to address all those 4 elements? So 3 kind of pillars of when we talk about strategy in the business school, or when we talk about strategy at the board table, is 3 different things. And some of them are done really well in my experience, and some of them are not done so well. And I'm going to go through those 3. The first one being scanning, so figuring out what's going on. The next one is developing strategies or strategizing. And then finally, because of how great a job you've done on scanning and strategizing, is succeeding. But once you succeed, you still have to continue to scan and strategize. Let me take you through those. So scanning, I find a lot of organizations deal with what their gut feel. And you see this especially with small to medium-sized businesses, where they say, that's a great opportunity because I feel it's a great opportunity. Or that's a great opportunity because Buddy's doing it down the street, or Buddy's doing it up in Toronto, and it works for there. Why wouldn't it work here? Danny Kahneman of Kahneman and Tversky, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, talks about the difference between type 1 and type 2 thinking. Type 1 thinking is basically gut feeling. And sometimes that gut feeling comes from wisdom, it comes from experience, it comes from doing it a number of different times. And most of our lives we spend in type 1 thinking. The way we drive a car, we don't even think about when we drive from one place to the other, we just do it. The type 2 thinking is more in terms of how do we actually start to question the assumptions? How do we start to get the evidence to back up our thinking to say, is this really correct? And one of the ways of engaging a more type 2 thinking, where you're, instead of just going with your gut, but you're actually verifying and justifying what that wisdom that you may have, is using an environmental scan. And one of the tools that we use in the business school for doing this type of environmental scanning as part of strategy is what you call a PEST analysis, or PESTEL analysis. So that's looking at what are those political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal trends that can impact us as an organization. And that's a really interesting debate and question to have when you're thinking about it from a strategic standpoint. what is happening politically, what is happening socially, and how is that going to impact us in terms of our strategy and what we want to try and do. Another way, the old charity that we always talk about, and it's been talked about since the late 1960s in business schools, is the notion of a SWOT analysis. So a SWOT analysis that was originally developed by Ken Anderson at the Harvard Business School talks about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and identifying what those are. And once you figure out what those are, then you'll be able to develop a strategy around that. In an uncertain time, I would say, let's flip that around. Let's instead spend more time talking about what are our threats and opportunities rather than spending all this time talking about how great we are in terms of our strengths. Because the strengths that you may have had 2 years ago or even 2 months ago are not necessarily the strengths that you have now. So what are your threats? What are your opportunities? What are your weaknesses and strengths? So basically taking a SWOT analysis and kind of flipping it on its head and saying, okay, let's talk about threats and opportunities, then weaknesses and strengths. Once again, uncertain times required for different models in terms of how you would look at things. One of the really nice models that we don't really talk about as much in terms of strategy, mostly because it's a little bit longer than your average approach, is basically what they call Martin's 5 questions. His name Roger Martin. I always call him Roger's 5 questions. But Roger Martin was the former dean of the University of Toronto Rotman School of Business, a very, very established board member, a very experienced business leader in Canada. And what Martin said is that basically when you're doing strategy, when you're thinking about strategy, there's 5 questions you should be asking yourself. Number 1, what are our broad aspirations for our organization and the concrete goals against which we can measure our progress? Number 2, across the potential field available to us, where will we choose to play and not to play? In our chosen place to play, how will we choose to win against the competitors there? What capabilities are necessary to build and maintain to win in our chosen manner? And what systems are necessary to operate and build and maintain the key capabilities? I'm not saying that, and for those people who don't operate in this environment on a regular basis, these are not natural questions that you would ask yourself, but it's a good way to reflect and say, okay, what do we want to do? Where do we want to be? Who's out there? What do we have that's going to make us win or make us succeed? I know win is I always think of Charlie Sheen when I think of winning, but in terms of, I think the word success is maybe a little bit better. And what do we have? What are those systems in place that we have to actually meet our goals and obligations, etc.? Okay, another great model that in terms of thinking about strategy in an uncertain world is the McKinsey 7S model. McKinsey is one of those worldwide global consultancies that if you want to say hello, it costs you about $100,000. Sorry, that's probably a bad joke, but they do lots of work for big government, big companies, etc. Now, their model that they use when you're assessing an organization is called the 7S model that was developed by Tom Peters. And the 7S model basically saying, what are the strategy, structure, and systems that an organization have? And then that's the hard element. And then the soft element being, what are the shared values, skills, staff, etc., that you need to have in place to actually make an organization succeed? So I got my alarm going off to tell me I've been speaking too long. So those strategy, structure, systems, shared values, skills, staff, and style really help an organization kind of define itself, figuring out where it wants to be, and moreover, in an uncertain time, give you a kind of a checklist to say, do we have all things in place to actually achieve our goals and objectives? So where do we see the opportunities? I'm going to go 5 minutes over, if that's okay, everyone. I'm happy to stay here for an extra 5 minutes or 10 minutes, however way you'd like me to answer all these questions. But where are some of the opportunities? So what we've seen coming out of the pandemic is digitization has been a big area. Number 2, automation. We see the move to automation, especially whether that's in the seafood industry or if it's in warehousing. We're seeing real opportunities in terms of digitization and automation. One of the interesting areas is developing cold, cool chain logistics and warehousing. That means that keeping things at a constant temperature, especially for food. If we have things coming not as far or coming into smaller places, cold chain logistics and warehousing is a big, big growth area. We're also seeing the regionalization of supply chains, as I mentioned before, because of what happened with China and what's happening globally with the closure of borders. Regional supply chains, especially we've seen with PPE equipment, et cetera, has to be there for sudden demand shifts. So we can't just rely on ordering something in China, waiting it for 3 months to arrive. We need to have it now. So we see more regionalization of supply chains. We're also going to see longer-term customer demand shifts, how they consume and shop, especially on retail. And, you know, like the way I bought a pair of hiking boots during the first week of the pandemic, and it was contactless pickup. Didn't try on the boots, but, you know, they worked really, really great. Thank you, outfitters. But that long-term customer demand shift, are people going to go back to retail stores? Are people going to go shopping? And how we work and the benefits we get from work are also shifting as well. So how many people are just happy to work from home instead of having to commute? What are the opportunities around that? What are the negative elements about that, et cetera? So the last thing is in terms of success. So how do you succeed? A couple different ways. One of the ways is ultimately help you define what you mean by success, which in my dealings with a lot of organizations, a lot of the research shows is that this is not as well defined as you would think would be. One of those key tools that you could do is what you call an OKR, and this is used by Google. It's used by a lot of organizations in the tech field, which is basically saying objective, O, where do you want to go? Key results, how will you know when you arrive there? And then the second element of thinking the barriers, what's slowing this down, and the actions, what are the day-to-day activities we need to address? So when you're finding success, you need to make sure that you're implementing as well. It's not just good enough to develop a strategy, but instead you actually have to implement the strategy. Once you start to implement the strategy, because we live in uncertain times, you have to adapt. Things happen, as we've seen with the pandemic. We've seen black swans, we've seen gray rhinos, we've seen shifts in consumer behavior, et cetera. How are you going to adapt in terms of what's going on? And moreover, how are you going to monitor and then actually report on all the success that you have? So how do you communicate your strategy? How do you manage your plan? How do you make it part of the way that you report, whether it's to your customers, to your shareholders, to the funders, if you're in the not-for-profit world, to your stakeholders? You have to think about this strategy document or this strategy approach just can't be something that's sitting on a shelf, but instead it should be a living, breathing, guiding document and a living, breathing, guiding approach to how you work as an organization. So in summary, we've seen a couple of different things. We've seen consumer behavior changes. Do you know who your clients and consumers are? Do you know what they want? Do you know their purchasing criteria? Secondly, supply chain disruption and regionalization. Can your business model accommodate those shifts? Can you, even in terms of your own life, accommodate those shifts as well? Flexibility is really, really important. There needs to be learning and adapting going on all the time. Can you pivot to where those opportunities are? Digitalization and e-commerce is very key. We've seen that already. The fact that we're here, we're discussing this online, is proof that digital is not going away in terms of how we do a whole bunch of things that we may not have done 6 months ago. And on a personal note, you need to be agile. What I would say that one of the great things about being an alumnus of Memorial University is it taught me to question. Those questions sometimes sound stupid, but I still ask questions. So you question the assumptions, question the gap. Think about the Rumsfeld matrix. Think about, are something really unknown unknowns, or something that we know that is unknown. And you need to reevaluate your own knowledge and make new discoveries as well. Are you missing something to help really kind of accommodate the pivots that we could expect in this uncertain world? So you have to figure out sooner what those known unknowns are and use your strategy to help you succeed. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. Thank you for letting me go over 5 minutes or so. Very happy to answer questions, and thank you once again.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. So we've got a few questions that have come in so far. I'll just remind everyone that in order to ask a question, what I'll ask you to do is use the Q&A function on the right side of this window that we're in. You might need to click the little arrow before the Q&A to expand it and type your message in. You can share those questions publicly, or you can send them to me privately. Please avoid using the chat. Please avoid sending the questions to Tom or John, just for efficiency's sake. But we will monitor them just to be safe. So I'll dive right into the first question, Tom. Touching on the challenges the province is in and will continue to face, how can an organization justify investing in maintenance or expansion of their firms in Newfoundland and Labrador? Moreover, how can firms mitigate the risk of increased taxes to fund the provincial deficit?
And it's a great question. It's a very tangly question as well. I would say to justify it is that we live in an amazing place. We live in a beautiful place. And as someone who's lived in London and spent time in Europe, and I've lived in Toronto as a teenager for a couple of years, it's hard from a business standpoint. If you're making an investment, do we invest in here? Do we invest in Nova Scotia? Do we invest in New York or New Hampshire, et cetera? I think we have to think out the long-term benefits of now living in a place where it's an island and living in a place where people may want to live rather than dealing with all the, if I'm sitting in downtown Toronto now and looking at Trinity Bellwoods Park, et cetera, is that a great place to live? And instead, should I be living in a place like Newfoundland, which as Rex Murphy once said, is a fog-filled Disneyland, but still, there is some really good benefits about living from here as well. So if you think about one of the bigger, even before the uncertainty, I think most organizations were really struggling in terms of attracting high-quality staff and getting really high-quality people in. I think we got to build the case that Newfoundland is a great place to live. I think if you're going to engage in that maintenance, if you're going to engage in that investment, you have to take the long run. You have to say, what is this place going to look like in 10 to 15 years? And I know there's challenges. And, people, Dave Vardy wrote a great article in the Telegram, and Ron Penny wrote a great article in the Telegram talking about what the world will look like post Muskrat Falls here in the province. There's going to be challenges, but I think once again there's resilience as well. As someone who's lived away and someone who's seen what it's like to live, to spend 45 minutes on your every day on a crowded tube in London with your nose in somebody's armpit, it's much better to pay a little bit higher taxes to live in a place like here. And I think, but that business case is difficult, I know, for businesses. And when I speak to business leaders, they ask those same sort of things. I think a diversified portfolio where you may be developing, where you may have some operations here and you have operations elsewhere, I think is going to be the key. But we can also think that Newfoundland was maybe a lot of places are like Newfoundland and Labrador now. They're going to struggle financially. I don't think we're maybe as unique as we once were a couple months ago.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. In terms of developing a strategy, do you pick one out of the strategies that you listed and implement, or can you do an implementation of all those strategies to try and predict a new normal?
I think in a number of ways, and it's a great question once again. Thank you to everyone for putting in questions. Thank you to everyone for listening. You're better than some of my MBA students who sometimes don't listen. It really depends on what you want to achieve as an organization. And traditionally in declining industries, there's 4 different strategies that you can take. Number one, you can harvest. So, when times are uncertain, you can basically say, I'm just going to take all my money. Number 2, you can differentiate and go unique. So I'm going to make sure I'm different than everybody else. Thirdly, you can just exit. You can say, look, I want to retire. I want to get out of here. This doesn't really make sense. And the fourth being the expansion. So you make further investments in terms of what you're trying to do. It really depends on your own risk appetite and depends on your own vision of where you want to be and how you want to take an organization. And I know some great local businesses and great local companies see the future. They see the future because they may have been tied here for 150 years, and they've only maybe been 10 years, and they realize the benefits of being in a place like Newfoundland and Labrador. So I think it ultimately, when you try and choose one of those strategies or think about all those different kind of elements that you could potentially look at in this uncertain time, you have to say what's going to work for you, what's going to work for where you want to be and what's your risk tolerance and what's your and where do you see it long term. I don't think it's going to be difficult the next couple of years. I don't think anybody who's in business or anybody who's in the not-for-profit sector or everybody is saying that the next 24 to 48 months is going to be a difficult time. And I really feel the pain. As someone who's privileged enough to work at university, I empathize and I sympathize. But there is lots of great support out there, and there's lots of great, I think there is great opportunities. I think it's just sometimes taking that step back and thinking about it and looking through the environment and saying, what are the things where we could really take our resources and put them to good use?
Yeah. Great answer. I'll just remind everyone that our session is being recorded, and I think, Tom, you've agreed to share the slides. Is that correct?
I have agreed to slides, yep.
So we can share that with everyone following the event.
And I apologize once again if I'm too quick.
Yeah, no worries. Well, that's why you can rewind and keep watching, right? How do you feel artificial intelligence technology will develop or grow as a result of this pandemic in relation to the building of a more resilient organization?
Another great question. Yeah, I'm sure some of these are my MBA students trying to get extra class participation marks in terms of going on there. Artificial intelligence, if you've been following, and machine learning is going to have major implications to so many different professions. So I sit on the board of the Chartered Professional Accountants in Newfoundland and Labrador, and you would say, that's a nice stable profession, and that's not going anywhere. Everybody needs an accountant. But if you look at what artificial intelligence and machine learning can do in terms of how we do accounting and how we do financial reporting, that's going to have a whole big structure in terms. That's, the accountants have been looking at that, and one of the leaders of that as a Newfoundlanders alumnus of Memorial, Tasha Batstone, was leading that at a national level for the CPAs. To answer your question in terms of where artificial intelligence, and I'll take machine learning as well, could impact, because of if we live in a contactless world, if we live in a world where we're social distancing and physical distancing, then that ability to engage. Justin has the usual child coming in and challenging him in terms of if you've heard the background noise, but I think it's going to keep on increasing. There was a great article in the New Yorker maybe 6-7 months ago, and they looked at plants in steel plants in the United States. And they looked at 1970s, there was something like 8,000 people working in the steel plant in Pennsylvania. And then they went and spoke to the people that were one of the last people from that era who was still working there. And they were down to 60 people doing the same amount of production, doing the same amount of steel based on a staff of 50, predominantly. And he said, what was the difference? So he said, well, first of all, the gender back up. He said, most of the people who work here now in the head office are female. Secondly, he said, most of them are very well educated. And thirdly, he said, it's a much nicer place to work. He said, it's much more safe. I feel more valued. And, ultimately, I miss some of the elements of those 5,000 people that we all used to work with, but it's made it a better place to work. But that's just for one person out of 5,000, right? And so ultimately, I think that artificial intelligence is coming anyway, regardless of whether there was a pandemic or not a pandemic. It just it reduces costs. It sometimes makes decisions better, but there's a big socioeconomic impact in terms of how artificial intelligence is going to do it from there. So I see further investments, if anything.
Okay. Thanks, John. In the background, my kids came down to say hi, and he muted me immediately. Boy, I tell you, we're good friends. With the shift in technology, can we expect job losses? The shutdown has closed business, put mega projects over budget. There's lots of uncertainty. How can we spin a positive growth? Very good question.
Very good question. So let's be realistic. Can we expect job losses? I think the answer is yes. Can we expect job losses across a whole bunch of different categories? Maybe not. I still think if you work in technology, you should be pretty much okay. If you work in other areas, it may be a good time to retire. I know that sounds really, really bad, for people who, I was speaking to one of my friends the other day who's a business advisor and owner, and they basically said, this is either going to retire us, Tom, or keep us working for the rest of our lives. And that's a difficult choice, right? And anytime you see these kind of events, you do see structural unemployment develop. I think with technology, technology is an opportunity, but it's also a threat, like anything. So when you think of it in terms of what are, is there skills that I'm missing that I can get? Is there skills that I'm not just going to be able to get? And so is it a good time for me to try and do something different? But we also, because of that, the great rhino in Newfoundland and Labrador is the demographics. We keep on getting older and older and older, and we haven't been able to attract as many new Canadians for lots of different reasons, for systemic reasons and for weather reasons and for cultural reasons. Although there's been great work that's been done by the Association for New Canadians and other organizations, and I think we increasingly get better. But the demographics mean is that we need to, we may have a reduced workforce anyway. So the question then becomes, from a business model standpoint, how can we use technology to replace those workers where we may not be able to find them anymore? And that requires that, to go back to the first question, that requires long-term investment. That requires thinking about, okay, not things in terms of 24 months or even 36 months, but maybe 60 months in terms of 5 years. Can we get our investment back? We, you know, for example, let's take that ubiquitous Canadian brand, Tim Hortons. Tim Hortons, which is now owned by a Brazilian private equity company. Tim Hortons, before the pandemic, had invested hugely in their Tim Hortons app, which is as somebody who goes to Tim Hortons, is great because the coffee's ready when I order it. They don't have to deal with me because it's sitting there waiting for me, and I can get my 3 Timbits for my dog, and I can get myself my coffee every morning without just saying hello to the manager, who's Claudia, and saying, hello, Claudia, and then moving out from there. So, but Tim Hortons has always struggled, or recently been struggling, to find people to go work for them. And that's much different than even when I was a university student, where I can still remember I graduated the year of the COD moratorium. So I feel my students' pain in terms of graduating. But there was lineups around the block to get jobs at Tim Hortons. Now they still, even in the pandemic, places are still recruiting. So I think it's where those jobs are and what type of jobs are. And then even, you know, for me as a professor, do we even need professors anymore? You know, those kind of questions. There's those big fundamental questions we can ask ourselves. And when we're developing strategies around it, saying, can we use technology to replicate or to create economies of scale, or just even question in terms of how we deliver value as organizations and as individuals to where we actually work.
Tom, is the government in a place to shift to do things differently, or continuing to do as before, even if the decisions are not popular to do differently, but is future forward? Can we get there because change is hard?
Change is very hard, and moreover, change is very, very hard in public sector environments, probably even more than private sector environments. In the private sector environment, we always have the profit motive. And the profit motive is someone who's worked in the private sector and now works in, I guess, in the higher education sector, but have worked with public sector organizations. With the profit motive is we can look at it and saying, what's our return on invested capital? What's our profit for this quarter, for this year? If we're not making enough, what do we need to do to change? With the public sector, you don't have that impetus. You don't have that constant pressure for decisions or as a decision-making tool. So as a result, government hasn't had to, doesn't necessarily, from a change management standpoint, those pressures to move have not been as pronounced because of the lack of a profit motive. There's positive things to that, and there's negative things to that. I think what government needs to do is that they look now, because of the pandemic, and eventually, as I mentioned before, the global fiscal looming crisis in terms of the ability to get debt, the ability to acquire capital, to invest in infrastructure, et cetera. If that's compromised, then government actually has to look at how they deliver things and saying, can we do it differently? And, you know, I've done research before where we've talked about public-private partnerships, lots of pros on that, some cons. lots of debate around it. You've seen the not-for-profit sector going into increasingly and delivering services that traditionally government did. And then thirdly, government exiting and saying, look, we can't do this anymore. We're just going to have the private sector do this because it's too costly. There's pros and cons about it. And I know for my students and my friends who are more, who believe in the notion of big government, and government workers work so hard and they're so passionate about what they do. But it's also, we need to have a government services that reflect 2020 and beyond, government services that reflect 1970 and before, which didn't have the technology, which had a younger population, which had maybe not as many challenges in terms of financial stability. You know, there's pros and cons, and it's a tangly issue, and I feel for our politicians because I know how hard they work and how hard they want and what they want best for the province. And so we sometimes have to question, do we need to have these things? Which I think is anytime there's a crisis, that ability to ask those kind of questions, it's a good time. Because when we're busy and successful, you don't ask those type of questions. You don't ask, should we have this? Should we be doing this, etc. Now is a good time. We got a little bit of time, even though some of us are really, really busy doing remote teaching.
Thank you. It is coming up on 1:50. I've got 5 questions left to ask. Just reminding everyone that if you wanted to leave at any time, feel free. And if you want to stick around, absolutely do that as well. This will all be recorded and shared via email after the fact. Are we expecting the same or worse recession in the Newfoundland and Labrador economy since oil and gas is badly impacted from the COVID-19 pandemic? And are we expecting more taxes from government?
Yeah, it's as someone who comes from I'm the black sheep of my family in that I didn't go to medicine. My dad's a doctor. I have 2 sisters who are doctors. My sister is a nurse. My mom was a nurse. I have cousins who are doctors. I was really myself and my other sister are the only ones who didn't go into that world. I was really confident in our ability to manage our public health, and I think we've done an exceptional job. And we can see that by the small number of deaths and small number of cases that we've had. But when we start to get into the kind of bigger issues around taxation, when we start to get into bigger issues in terms of how financially, what is this going to look like? It's difficult, right? And I think it's even more complex than the public health, because you could say, look, stay at home and life will be good. But we can't do the same thing in terms of economic recovery. I would say that the recession will be worse than because of oil and gas. And especially you have to think of all those amazing workers who commute back and forth between Alberta and now with the oil sands being effectively being shut down because it's a high cost producer, and them not coming back and forth. With the pause in exploration that's going on in the province, it's the oil and gas industry which has been so beneficial to Newfoundland and Labrador. And anytime you have to kind of question, say, okay, well, what's it going to look like? And I know that NOIA, the Industry Association, has done an amazing job trying to point that out and saying how beneficial it has been to the province. There's no question. But there is all those macroeconomic shifts. And about, do we need oil if we're not commuting to work as much? Which is interesting. I was thinking about, preparing for the talk. It's interesting, in China, there's more people driving to work now because people don't want to be in people don't want to be on public transport. So they're having major car jams, traffic jams, because people don't want to share public transport with each other. So we don't really know, but we do know that Saudi Arabia and Russia were fighting before this in terms of this oil crisis. So this is not just all pandemic related. It is because of the glut of oil and Saudi Arabia and Russia going at each other from a kind of an oil war, I guess, best way to describe it. Not physically in terms of, physical armaments, but more in terms of pricing, et cetera. But, so would I expect taxes to rise? Yes. Would I expect there to be a recession? Yes. And that's difficult. And as someone who pays, lots of taxes, but sees the benefit from those taxes, it's going to be a difficult time. And that's why I say, I think it's for everybody. It's not just going to be for the private sector that has to share the pain.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. which sectors of the economy are likely to recover or respond the fastest and which the slowest?
I think when they open the doors, I think tourism will respond favorably, because ultimately people want to come to places where there's difference, where it's getting, can you imagine, like, you're in Toronto and you're staying in a condo and you're locked in there for, the last 3-4 months, and you're seeing beautiful ads for Newfoundland and Labrador, and you kind of go, I can drive there. It's a long, long way, but I can drive there, and I can go to a place where, we don't have to worry about 400 new cases a day or whatever it was in numbers. Sorry, I don't know exact numbers in Ontario, but I know they're much worse than what we have here. I think tourism respond. I think the first one is going to respond, though, is going to be, if we look at what's happened in the past, retail has normally responds right away. So once they open the shops, people will go shopping again. That's normal one to respond. Now the question is, how do you make up for the last 3-4 months of negative cash flow and going forward? I think oil and gas is going to take, especially on the exploration side, so the upstream side is going to take longer than the downstream side. And I think air travel especially, they're going to be, I think the air travel industry is saying maybe 2022, 2023, before they even, and maybe even 2025, before they get back to what it was normal. And as someone who stepped off a plane in March the 6th, I had just come back from a work trip in the Caribbean. I can see that, because it's hard to physically distance in airports. It's hard to physically distance in planes. Until we actually have a vaccine, then I think there's going to be people are going to be reluctant to get on planes. But at the same time, you can drive, and I do think, as long as Marine Atlantic can get to kind of satisfy people's concerns about getting from one point to the other, and if the people are willing to spend $2,000 or maybe a little bit more money to get on an Air Canada flight and go 3.5 hours and be physically distanced, then I think there's some really good possibilities.
Mm. That's an interesting point, and from a tourism perspective, to be an area that has low number of cases or is being managed to keep it down low and keep the curve low, what that means as a tourism factor. Absolutely.
I'd be promoting the hell out of that if it was me, and I'd be saying, listen, this is, come to a place where, we naturally physically distance, because we have lots and lots of space, and we have amazing food. We have really great tourism operators. I just think, I know how much people have invested, and the problem is, when you make a big investment, you got to pay that back. You got to pay your interest on that. And if you suddenly lose your cash flow for a year, that may be enough to tip you over, whereby you're not solvent anymore. So those big investments people have made, that's difficult. And one of the things globally that we're seeing for businesses is that the bigger are getting bigger, because they had the resilience, they had the reserves, they had the ability to weather this. It's the smaller businesses and the small to medium-sized businesses are the ones that didn't have those resources. So that's why I encourage people, and we as a family are going out and trying to use as many small to medium-sized businesses locally in terms of acquiring whatever we need than we may have done in the past.
Mm-hmm. I think what we'll do is we'll clue this up at 2. So I'm going to do 2 more questions. So I won't be able to get to them all, but I'll share these with Tom, and you can provide me with responses, and I can share them back to people and all that.
Sure.
So the last 2. Given the financial position the province and businesses are currently in, do you think there is any risk of larger financially healthy firms monopolizing certain industries through merging with or purchasing smaller firms that are currently struggling?
Yeah, that would. I don't think that's just even in the province. I think that's globally. You're going to see acquisitions, what you call distressed assets, where, like I said, someone could have made a huge amount of investment in a business, and now it's not there anymore. For example, the low-cost Norwegian airline, I forget what they're called now, they had to give up 95% of the business in order to get a government loan. And the government will take that over for a while, and then they'll sell it to somebody else. And so you're going to see that's the nature, unfortunately, of market and capitalism, is that if you have the resources, you can acquire the resources, this is a good time to be buying, and that's unfortunately if you've invested your life's work, could be gone because, you overexpanded at the wrong time because of the pandemic and what was going on. But for those people who've all that work and all that effort may be capitalized by somebody else. So I would expect that, yes. And so the question then becomes, do we have government saying you can't do that? And in some jurisdictions they are. I think in Australia they said there's no foreign acquisitions over the next 3 or 4 months or 6 months or something like that. So that is a policy intervention you can make. It's not a popular one, but it's one that you could make in terms of, especially to protect national industries from foreign acquisition. So.
Excellent, thank you. It's funny, you mentioned Norway just then. Our last question will be, hello from Norway. What, if anything, do you feel the Newfoundland Labrador government could do to attract more business or encourage Newfoundlanders to move back home, bringing their businesses with them? Yeah,
I think it's a great question, because we have this dysphoria of amazing people, and as someone who made the decision to move back home when he was 36 and living in London, and there's lots of amazing things living in big cities, lots of negative things living in big cities. I think you just got to make the business case, and I think in a number of ways, if there is any flexibility on the government saying, listen, if you are a Newfoundlander and you want to come back, here are the opportunities, and then moreover, maybe we can give you some, tax-free holiday for a couple of years or something like that. I haven't really thought about it, to be fair. But I think the virtues of, and I'm a big proponent of Newfoundland and Labrador. You can't forget Labrador, because Labrador is an amazing place as well. But there's lots of great things about living in this environment. And I think sometimes we forget that because we get too busy, or we forget we think about all the negative things. And I think in a number of ways, sometimes you have to be a cheerleader and talk about the positive things. We're going to have a rough 24 months, maybe a rough 36 months. How do we cheerlead? How do we talk about this is a great place to live? And this is great things in terms of, if you, my cousin lives in Toronto, and he was brought up in Toronto. But if you want to buy a house in Toronto, good luck. $1.5, $1.2 million. If you can do the same job here in Newfoundland Labrador and buy your house for $200, $400, $300, whatever, to me that's pretty good. And if, moreover, because of remoteness, it doesn't really matter that if you're in Toronto anymore, you can be here. And I think that's the great opportunity I think this is going to give us, is that one of the problems that we've always had was isolation, because we're an island. If technology is going to take away that isolation, if it's going to let us do these kind of talks, and hello from Newfoundland to Norway, or hello to Qatar, or hello to Australia and New Zealand, and we can do business, and we can engage with those kind of people, and we can deliver our expertise, our people across those borders, and make a living for ourselves here, then I think that's a really great opportunity.
Excellent. Guys, I want to thank everybody for all the fantastic questions. Thank you everyone who joined us online today. I think we all got pretty much around 180 people at the peak today, and they stuck around to the end. A lot of those stuck around to the end. A big thanks to Dr. Cooper for all that you shared today. And I want to send another thank you to the Gardner Center and the Conference and Event Services team here at Memorial's Emera Innovation Exchange. And before we go, I just want to say that the alumni engagement team, they're really working hard to help the university's alumni stay connected and provide the kind of engagement opportunities our alumni want most. Our next leadership webinar is 1 week from today, on Wednesday, June 3rd at 1 p.m. with Heather Peters, and she'll be discussing leading and engaging teams virtually. We hope to see you there. Thanks again, Tom. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Take care and best wishes.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.